into this the study of memory and memory practices. So yeah. The first question is always, why would one want to study 4chan? And I've here included the bombastic version of the answer. This is an image taken on January 6th, 2021, during the Capitol Hill insurrection. And we see in this photo, we see two insurrectionists waving what is known as the Kekistani flag. If you notice in the corner of the erect flag, there's a logo of 4chan, and Kekistan is this sort of fictional meme country that the alt-right or extreme right denizens of 4chan sort of inhabit within the lore and culture of 4chan. So with that, it sort of shows that what is done on 4chan is usually for a smallish and old forum has a disproportionately large impact on politics and internet culture in general. Secondly, I think there's an equally interesting and much less bombastic answer, which relates to the fact that 4chan is, and I'll get into that, through its design and its culture, sort of a microcosm of an extreme microcosm of some of the tendencies we see in internet culture in general. And for that reason, it's also quite interesting to study. So that's my argument for why we should study 4chan. Moving on, 4chan, as I said, is an old and weird forum. It has a very has a spotted history from Lulz to QAnon and beyond. I've called this slide. And I think to really understand what 4chan is, you have to sort of envision where it comes from. So 4chan last year in October 2020, 20 years old, which you can't say for many current internet spaces. 4chan arose out of the forum that was at the time called Something Awful, and on Something Awful there was a forum called, and hold on, it was called the Anime Death Tentacle Rape Whorehouse. And on this very nasty named forum, the users were angry at the draconian level of moderation going on. So they decided to make their own, or some of this group decided to make their own forum where sort of anything goes. And from that grew a number of subforums. Initially at the odds, the subforum that was most prevalent was the random or /b/ forum. And I think most people who were sort of into internet culture or in and around internet culture in the arts know the products of B, as it's colloquially named. In the slideshow, there is Rick Astley and the practice of Rick rolling. There is a slew of memes, rage phases, some more sort of site-specific ones, Pedo Bear, that kind of thing. Also, and very famously, there's the hacktivist movement Anonymous, who grew out of B, which was the most publicized among a string of sort of childish sort of very strange media insurgencies. Anonymous politically hacking MasterCard in relation to the WikiLeaks thing being the biggest one, but also all the many weird instances of media manipulation or cheating like local news channels into thinking that teenagers were getting high off of snorting poop fumes or stuff like that. So the B era was very whimsical. It was very weird. It was very, very sort of non-political. in a certain sense, or at least very sort of anarchistic and justice-seeking in its political motivations. Somewhere in the beginning of the 10s, the user base and the interest starts to shift towards another subforum on 4chan called Pol, or the politically incorrect forum, which is the one we're going to talk about today, and the one that Philip and I are both primarily studying. Out of Pol grew what we would today probably be hesitant to still call the alt-right, but definitely what in the 2016 and the period around that time was known as the alt-right. There's a big mobilization movement around Trump, and a slew of new sort of more politically charged memes, with the NPC meme here. Can you see my mouse if I move it around the screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. The NPC meme, and also sort of these like weird things, weird sort of niche things, niche memes. Most harmfully of all, we see a range of conspiracy theories sort of loosely string together into a narrative that is most commonly known as QAnon. QAnon is this very popular theory that stems from 4chan, that sort of hails Donald Trump specifically as the savior chosen by the people in opposition to a pedophilic cabal of actors operating from within the United States, like deep within the United States government, also known as the deep state. Yeah, so we see the shift from 4chan goes from sort of a weird, whimsical place into this like space of extremism, and that's sort of the broad strokes history of 4chan. Moving on, 4chan. The reason why 4chan is interesting, as I talked about with affordances, is because it has a very unique design, especially in a context of sort of the 2024 internet. All users are anonymous by default, meaning that your username will be anonymous. You can write in a username, but that username is not claimable. So anyone can use the same username. That means that you have no idea who you're talking to most of the time. You can identify people within a single thread, but not sort of across different threads on the site or across time. The site has a content creation system which allows for 200 active threads at a time, which means that if I make a thread, my thread will take the #1 position. These are ranked, and then pushing the thread in position number 200 out. That is now deleted. You can also comment on a thread, and that moves the thread to the #1 position. And then there's some technicalities about like how many comments can be a thread before it becomes unbumpable. All in all, everyone are anonymous, and threads usually become inactive after no more than 3 hours, with a few exceptions. A typical post would look like this, where it has with an opening post will have an image. The username being anonymous is up here. There's an ID that identifies the person within the single thread, but if you post it in another thread, you'll have another unique ID. And then you get you can have a flag that's usually based on your on the location of your IP address, or you can choose to hide your location and use a so-called meme flag, which can be like a political symbol or something silly like a pirate flag. There's like a set range you can choose. Then you can comment and quote each other's comments, but it's not in a sort of it's not nested. It's not a very sort of intuitive design, and especially now that is 20 years old, it's a very dated design. There's a catalog of the 200 threads. You can go, you can see these are the threads on the site. Whenever a new thread is made, the oldest one is then sort of archived for a short time and then deleted. So this talk is entitled sort of an analysis from an affordance theory-based perspective, and my PhD is also from that perspective. My affordance theory is a really well-suited tool to study 4chan because it allows for these like wholesomely oriented socio-technical or social-material perspectives. So affordance theory, at its most basic, characterizes the relationship between features of an environment and the use of those features by individuals or groups that inhabit that environment, right? So in essence, talking about affordance theory, we talk about the way that a certain environment influences the individuals and groups within that environment, or vice versa. And that's a very useful lens to look to sort of look at 4chan through, because it's such a weird environment that a bunch of normal sort of societal rules or rules in Western culture is thrown out the window, or cannot apply here, right? Mainly, I operate with 3 affordances. 2 of them, mostly anonymity and ephemerality, and contingency is kind of an interesting one that we'll touch a bit upon, but not too much. This is also something that's what is generally mentioned in the literature on 4chan. These are these 3. Anonymity is the sort of the thing that's been studied the most about 4chan. Anonymity has the effect of not having, like, you can't know who anyone are. And that means users don't have any reputational capital at all. And having no sort of reputational capital means that you need to signal, or users need to signal belonging to an in-group in sort of very specific ways, or constantly signal that they're part of the in-group. That has led to the rise of a very specific sort of vernacular, which is both visual in memes, as we see here. We have the 2 examples of classic pool memes, what is known as a Bojack and Pepe the frog, which is also a famous symbol of pool. And then it leads to a sort of a specific form of antagonism, because you can never have any credentials, you can never have too much belonging. So you need to constantly signal that you are part of the group. And you do that with the sort of visual, but also with a linguistic vernacular, and also by constantly attacking other users, especially if they exhibit behavior that's outside what is sort of considered normative in this space, or considered to be a good way of showing your belonging to the group. Secondly, ephemerality is key. And I've brought this. I like to bring this this stage of visualization, because it sort of brings it has a cool wow factor, but also with some explanation sort of makes sense. So what we see here is the positions of poll threads on poll over an hour taken every 2 minutes, and the little dots in the columns represents the 200 positions that threads can inhabit. And what you can see is that the top threads have a lot of sort of dynamic movement around. People will comment on them. They'll change positions. And then as threads sort of make their way to the bottom, they become less and less engaged with and are slowly washed away by the content creation system. You see a few examples here of like threads that are suddenly brought to the top. But in general, this is how the ephemerality works. And this ephemerality is really important in making the content sort of alive on 4chan. What I mean by that is that if when you already have a need to constantly signal in-group identity and use it and need to use specific language or specific vernacular to show in-group status, that in-group status or that vernacular is then, because of the lack of permanence, because of the ephemerality of constant churn of content, always posted new content, with everything being deleted, archived all the time, that sort of churn really speeds up the reproduction of vernacular content, and will sort of very easily allow that content to mutate on repetitions, meaning that a high speed subcultural of subcultural innovation will arise in this space, because you'll have to demonstrate visually and linguistically your belonging to the group, but the way you do that is constantly changing by the need to reiterate it all the time, both because you don't have persistent reputational capital that you can bring from thread to thread, but also because the threads are changed so rapidly. Lastly, there's contingency, and I've brought a little quote from this user here, from commenting on the work of some colleagues from the University of Amsterdam, basically saying that users, I use this in my methods section in my dissertation, that this user criticizes the use of sort of data analytics perspectives, because it doesn't really sort of get the real-time flow of the 4chan experience, and it doesn't really, and this is the sentence I love, there's nothing quite like the comfy thrill of a proper happening thread. What does that mean? This means this describes the feeling that is very prevalent on 4chan of being part of something, like contingently going to the site and then being part of something that you can then brag about happened later. You can't prove that you were there, but being part of those things are a really important part of 4chan culture. That also means that they're very, very, very oriented towards, sort of very motivated to making things happening. So, oh, this thing's going on, you know, like we're figuring all this shit out. They have this like idea of making up investigations or narratives or all these kinds of things, or being there discussing something that's ongoing, that's current, that's in the moment, and contingently hitting upon that feeling of a happening thread is a really sort of important thing to be part of in the culture, and also motivates them to sort of participate and contribute to something happening, right? Yeah. So just to sum up on the affordance things, right? And on anonymity and ephemerality, makes fast-paced subcultural innovation and really irregular memory practices. So there's this sort of because nothing is saved, or you can't go back and look at what's going on within the site. The archives exist and are sometimes used, but it's sort of a faux pas to use these archives. It's seen as bad form. These memory becomes extremely irregular and distributed, and sort of also somehow also often inscribed into the visual mimetic vernacular of the site. At the same time, contingency motivates individuals to sort of contribute to experiential flow and also these like happenings. It's really important to be part of, to make something happen. This affordance structure, if you might call it that, but sort of produces both things of extreme banality, like this is a very specific British meme about British people who are football fans, but very banal, not really a big political statement, not really, just like a normal, everyday sort of observational satire. But it is also productive of a culture that can produce something like this image, which is, again, the January 6th insurrection, and the horned guy in the photo is known as the QAnon shaman, and is a specific QAnon influencer. So we get something that, for the most time, produces banal, although problematic, often racist and extremist content. Also produces, but banal content also is capable of producing these like big, large-scale insurgencies. Yeah, and to do that latter thing, what we see is the need for users to specifically be able to curate sort of something to hold on to in this very ephemeral and chaotic sort of movement, constantly flowing movement space that is 4chan, which also sort of is born out of the need for some sort of institutional or collective memory, in a sense. This is more specifically what my PhD is about. To answer that question, or sort of to solve that problem, on 4chan, the users have evolved this concept of the general thread community, sort of community in very in a very loose sense of the word. So the general threads are a practice where users can repost on the same theme or topic, including some of the same information, over and over and over and over and over again, in order to create sort of, to counteract this ephemerality of the the sites, and to enable them to have a continuous conversation, this in spite of this, right? And an example of that is coronavirus general number 5298, that I've highlighted here from from 2021. So you can kind of see how often, from the beginning of COVID to when this was screenshotted in early 21, or less than a year into the pandemic, how many iterations of this specific kind of thread there's been. I've more of that in a little bit. So what they do is that they have these like conventions for a community that sort of develop over time. And what they have is that they'll have sort of a set format of information. That information slowly changes over time, but it's also a way to have a series of repeated posts with some of the same information. And then always in the bottom, highlighted with yellow here, you have some resources outside the ephemeral space. This is that you can then draw on to make these threads, which has sort of recipe and which has resources to use. This, yeah. So looking at these, this is data up until early 2022, with an overview, sort of a very high level thematic overview of the kind of themes present in that these sort of communities represent. So on the horizontal axis are numbers of comments made to 4chan threads. And you can see, just to give us, just to indicate sort of a scale of what the sort of themes can garner enough interest for someone or for groups of people to curate a community around, to sort of catch, to sort of make a steadfast point in ephemerality and create institutional memory and all these things. Trump, obviously big. National politics range from over a different group of nationalities in this case. Wars and conflicts often gets a lot of interest. When Syria, when Ukraine, various Gaza now is big, various insurgencies around the world. COVID-19 had a ton of posts, and you can see sort of all these themes are pretty much what you would expect from this kind of space. Moving on, the top specific communities, the top 10 specific communities are the President Trump one, which is sort of the mobilization space for Trump support on Pol. We'll talk a little bit about that later. It's Britpol, which is the British, sort of the British space on Pol, and we'll also talk about a little bit more about that later. And then, as I said, Syria, the war in Syria, a big geopolitics in general. War in Syria changed to geopolitics general shortly in the end of my data set. COVID, Australian politics, Nazi community, like an outright ideological Nazi community, and then some German. Krautpol is 4chan speech for German. Like these are sort of the biggest communities on the site. What these sites can do, and this is my attempt to sort of both to relate this to conspiratorial memory practices. What these communities do is that they sort of make these they create this sort of folklore, these sort of folklore stories or narratives that rely on the community having some sort of memory practice inscribed into their specific vernaculars. And Tommaso Venturini wrote in 2021 a very interesting paper on conspiratorial folklore, where he is more on that, where he jumps on. I see I've spent a little too much time, so I'm gonna be quicker here. But he talks about sort of this. He takes a point of origin in Walter Ong's notion of secondary orality to sort of liken a lot of these ephemeral online spaces to oral cultures, where memory is is sort of perceived through, or memory memory and events are preserved through sort of repetition, which makes a lot of sense, both in the ways that these communities are set up to counteract the affordances of 4chan, but also in terms of just how meme culture, born a lot out of 4chan itself, functions today, right? And this quote is sort of 4chan communities assure the perpetuation without preservation of their folklore through the classic oral technique of timeless repetition. I have a few examples of that. I think I'll go over. This is in the British community. The British Army has a sort of has an intelligence unit called the 77th Brigade, tasked with monitoring online threats. And so everyone who sort of talks outside of the group speak is labeled as being an undercover agent of this intelligence unit, which is both highly conspiratorial, but also sort of is a way of the community lore, is a way that community lore sort of can be used to police members and make sure that speech is done in the correct way. These are examples from the Trump stuff where narratives were built up about the organizers of these threats. So many of these especially the Trump one, very organized threads are posted every half hour on the hour. And sort of, so the organization of that then becomes part of the memory practices of the space of the community, and they create these sort of semi-fictional, semi-conspiratorial lore about this, like the Awuminati and the secret guild of the bakers, because bakers bake bread, and so thread rhymes with bread, so that's slang, and then bread, who makes bread? Bakers. So yeah. And here we have the Illuminati, and sort of all this like sort of weird fake narrative about them, the sort of organizers of the community. More interestingly, and I think my last point, are the Pizzagate and QAnon conspiracy theories that I also think Philip will talk a little bit about later. This, for those who don't remember, Pizzagate, it was a conspiracy theory that grew out of 4chan and became really popular in just after the election in 2016, the election of Trump, the American election in 2016, which sort of posited that there was an evil cabal of pedophile Satanists in Washington that was related to the Hillary Clinton campaign specifically, and in general, just like high-ranking members of the Democratic Party. Pizzagate later grew into QAnon, and Pizzagate and QAnon sort of came out of these types of communities. So what you're seeing here on the screen is a screenshot of the very first Pizzagate post, where someone sort of has looked into the WikiLeaks from the Hillary Clinton campaign, and then makes this really weird jump in logic about how pizza is slang for having sex with children, and then this photo from the leaks, which is of some North Korean defectors having pizza at a place called the Comet Pizza, at a pizza restaurant in Washington, Comet Ping Pong, which was implicated in this conspiracy theory. And then sort of what you can see here are sort of the numbered iterations of the Pizzagate general thread as the story or the narrative or the collective investigation and memory of this specific conspiracy community grows. And what you can sort of see, what you should notice are the lines here in the opening posts, sort of becoming more numerous as more sort of is uncovered and then is inscribed into the repetitious posts of the general thread in order to sort of create this narrative on 4chan that then became really big and resulted in the man forcing his way into the pizza parlor in Washington and demanding to save the children from the basement. And obviously the place didn't even have a basement. The same can be said for QAnon. What you see here is some work done by some colleagues in Amsterdam, where they gathered all the sort of a bunch of examples from what became QAnon. And essentially, QAnon starts as some guy posting as Q, someone supposedly with high-level clearance near the Trump presidency, documenting the Trump's fight against this evil, satanic, pedophilic, you can put on more words, cabal within the United States government. And this is the same example of sort of these communities being used to combat ephemerality and create, especially in the case of the very conspiracy-oriented, a conspiratorial folklore and conspiratorial sort of oral memory, even though this is a written medium. Yeah, so I think that, and that sort of brings us to this perspective, or to my last point, which is that the environment and the culture, the affordances, play a key role in the way that memory exists on the site, on the board, especially when the need for memory practices sort of encourage or contributes something to the user's need for creating collectivities or community. And in that way, sort of the need for collective memory becomes a motivating factor in creating communities, and these communities then are catalysts for these media insurgencies and incubators for these conspiratorial narratives. Yeah, that was what I had, and I even think I went significantly over time. I hope we'll have enough time for questions. Philip?
That's so perfect. Thank you very much for your presentation, Daniel, and no problem with going over time, as you being the only sort of academic that I've invited for presenting. I guess you got the privilege of using that time. So I'll also just briefly share my little presentation, again going from the outset of the sort of voices of the users of Pole. Now that we've got a general overview of some of the features of Pole, I'll be looking at a specific memory-related concept, that being what is colloquially known as memory holding. Let's see. Yep. So the term memory holding actually comes, and of course, when we're dealing with conspiracies and ideas about like totalitarian powers ostensibly trying to control us, of course, then you know, the 1984 is a very classical, if not downright banal source. And the concept of memory holding also comes from that book, and it says that sort of when we get the introduction to Winston as this protagonist in the story, we talk about the memory hold like and within easy reach of Winston's arm, a long oblong slit protected by a wire grating, For some reason, they were nicknamed memory holes. When one knew that any document was due for destruction, or even when one saw a scrap of waste paper lying about, it was an automatic action to lift the flap of the nearest memory hole and drop it in, whereupon it would be whirled away on a current of warm air to the enormous furnaces which were hidden somewhere in the recesses of the building. So it's sort of very physical hole in which you destroy evidences and by that effect also memory. But this concept is what I've looked at and how it's specifically used on 4chan and picked up by them and in a way used in a slightly different way than its original intention. So one of the ways and the primary way that I've looked at this has been actually using computational methods where I extracted some old posts containing this reference to memory holding and its various synonyms, getting around 40,000 unique posts. And then I did sort of a very cursory content analysis, training a model to embed words, thereby like ascribing meaning to them in sort of a geometrical space in which the words, based on their sort of associative meaning, can be calculated as sort of vectors and their closeness to each other. And then you'd use some sort of clustering technique to then computationally figure out like which words are then supposed to appear together. And you can see here an example where you would have a topic such as topic X here with a number of top words that are calculated as being most associated with this specific topic. And here you have like Russian invasion, Russian propaganda, Russian missiles, Ukraine invasion. And then you can also have the original documents itself that are then assumed to be most closely related to those words and also to the centroid of that specific cluster, where, you know, with its one being something about like how we're overemphasizing the strength of the Ukrainian forces, and in actuality, we are sort of memory holding their failed attempts to retake territory from the Russians. But so using this technique, I've been able to sort of reconstruct various features of this memory holding discourse that we see on 4chan. And one of the sort of avenues that I've looked at has been the antagonists, the ones who are performing or using memory holding. And if we start out here, you can sort of see a connection between the very classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theory of the international Jew, the Zionist occupation government controlling basically everything, our entire lives, and like we have specific examples of like, why do you think the Jews would allow this? This is clearly going to be memory hold and never spoken of again. Like memory hold, Jews don't care what happens to boy. Far-right conspiracies that push a full narrative about pedophiles and high positions, or a way that sort of denigrating stereotype of a Jew speaking. We need to memory hold the Epstein thing. So we have this connection between both Judaism, Jews, and then this pedophile elite being behind a lot of these memory holding cases. It got memory hold pedos won again because pedos defend their kind. We have references to Pizzagate, as Daniel had already talked about. And then on the other hand, we also see these government institutions such as the FBI and CIA come into play, where they are seen as the ones who are covering up specific events. The FBI still hasn't come up with a narrative, and actually the whole thing has been memory hold. CIA took over the investigation, thereby, you know, it's case closed, and everything gets memory hold. And in conjunction with the government institutions, you also have the mainstream media, of course, being controlled by these actors. CNN hardly covered it, so this will be the fastest memory hold in the last few years. Same as Fox News. They will make sure they never speak of it again. The Medfia, I assume being the mafia and media combined, as well as with these triple parentheses, which tend to indicate in 4chan vernacular, indicating the Jews are trying to memory hold it. And then finally, as sort of a non-ancient actor, we have the normies or the non-player characters, which are like this unenlightened mass that haven't, it's like the 4chan users, seen the light. They haven't taken the red pill. They haven't yet understood how the world is structured around these different forces. You act as if NPCs have long-term memory. They can forget everything that happened a week ago if the media decides to memory hold it. It's just memory hold now. The normies still think, well, but our government would never do that. So they're sort of the sheeple in this context. So another thing that the topic model reveals is the various ways that the users engage with the concept of memory holding. And so they're not just talking about the specific events or the antagonists behind the act of memory holding, but they also like have a specific response to the act of memory holding. First of all, there's like this just a general engagement of people discussing, oh, so we're talking about a memory holding event. I totally forgot about that. So okay, so this was memory hold. Then also a bit of like some contrarianism or negotiation about what is a memory hold, what isn't a memory hold. Then quite curiously, we also have this perceived expectation of things that will eventually become memory holds. So when they start discussing things that they perceive as possibly being within this conspiratorial framework, they're expecting the threats to get memory hold soon. Posting in this before it gets memory hold, taking bets now, how quickly does this get memory hold? So this expectation of what they're talking about being so controversial that the powers that be need to engage in memory holding. There's also, of course, information seeking about specific memory holding events. What are the most blatant examples of them? What's your favorite memory hold event? Again, perhaps a bit more of like a collective engagement there. And then we, of course, also have an objection to the act of memory holding, that don't let this get memory hold. OP, that's the original poster, is in disinformation shield. They're out in force. Don't let the memory hold this. So this responds to the act of memory holding, which also go hand in hand with archiving. That a lot of when poll users are talking about memory holding, they're also talking about preserving what they perceive as being in danger of coming memory hold. Archive that page. Holy shit, did this get memory hold? I just found it, and then posting a link. Save it now because Google is also phasing out the ability to filter results, things like that. And then finally, there is a general collective appreciation of those specific users on 4chan that are, or on Poll, that are engaging in trying to preserve or point towards things that are getting memory hold. So thank you for posting this. It's been largely memory hold. Oh, this was memory hold. Thanks for the reminder. Those were fun threads. Man, the memory hold is real. I forgot until you mentioned it. So a lot of also appreciation for this response to memory holding. And then like my final points, so we have the specific behavior relating to memory holding on 4chan, and we have the antagonist, but what do they see as being actually memory holds? And there's a lot more examples that I found besides these, but these was just the ones I seem to think is most interesting and relevant to this discussion. One of them being this old conspiracy theory of the white genocide and the great replacement theory, where, well, it's it's a complicated conspiracy in the sense that it acts and references different developments, both being relating to migration, being related to birth rates, but in this sense, it seems to be very much more violence focused. Of, well, in, for example, America, Black perpetrators attacking white people is something that they say, oh, so the media is not going to cover this. We also have terrorist attacks by Islamic terrorist attacks, the Manchester bombing. Don't let the memory hold these dead, like they did to Eva Ekelund, which was a girl that also passed away due to, or was killed as part of an Islamic terrorist attack in Sweden. And then we also have the false flags, being these government organized events in order to sort of psychologically manipulate people into making a specific political decision, often in the context of gun rights. So the conspiracy revolves around government agents recruiting or forcing troubled young men to perform these mass shootings, such as school shootings, and in the sense that they're not actually false flags, or they didn't happen, or you have crisis actors, and again, the reporting of this then becoming memory hold. The Marga bomber was 100% a false flag. It's already been memory hold. It was way too obvious. Then we have the Pizzagate conspiracy. I don't want to talk that much about it, but again, just basically seeing it as being memory holds by, or being debunked by the media. But in reality, it still exists in the Poles' conspiratorial minds, and ostensibly is then becoming memory hold because the normies are just following the media and things like that. Then there is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, again, touching on various aspects of it, but often regarding like different mandates, such as, or restrictions like the vaccinations or the wearing of masks, where they're like, well, the media narrative of what we know about COVID-19 apparently seems to shift so much, so there must be some sort of conspiracy behind it of, well, either that governments are have created COVID in order to control the government, or in a more milder sense, at least just using the COVID-19 pandemic to force things such as mandatory vaccines, or the wearing of masks, or in other ways in which in their mind you are able to control the population. And then there's the Ukraine war, as I mentioned before, like how, again, very much tied to the media reporting of it, about how apparently the Western media is overemphasizing the strength of the Ukrainian forces, and in reality, all of these various counteroffensives are now getting memory hold because they didn't work out. And then we also have, like, of course, with Trump and the 2020 election, a lot of memory holding about how, well, either Biden being corrupt or being a pedophile becomes memory hold, or something that Trump is trying to shine a light on is then also becoming silenced in memory hold, just like the media will do, will just memory hold everything like they always do. And then the George Floyd protest, which I think is also an interesting one, in which, again, also very much based on mainstream media and the discourse, primarily in the US, surrounding the George Floyd protests as being, well, of course, a legitimate response to racial tensions and things like that. But in the minds of the poll users and more conservative users, that these were then, like, just, it was a riot, it was just people out smashing things. And so in a way that the media is now trying to sort of hide the catastrophe that the apparently George Floyd protests were. So, like, they're becoming memory hold. It was such a disaster for the left. Don't let the media memory hold the BLM riots and things like that. And now I should say again that the work I'm doing now is still very much a work in progress. So this is still like ideas I'm toying around with. But when we look at this concept of memory holding, I think there is, well, it points toward that it's very decidedly fixed within this realm of post truth politics. So this idea that there is this public anxiety towards the authenticity, the accuracy, and the legitimacy of claims being made by politicians, being made by the media, and how that then has an effect on politics itself. So it no longer becomes this clamoring of ideologies, but it becomes a game of who can tell the truth, or whose truth is most believable, and that we are within this realm of fake news where nobody actually knows what's up and down. And I think that these two little graphs very much emphasize this point that I should explain that this is just like the top one is the absolute numbers of references to memory holding and its synonyms on poll, and then below it we have a normalized reference, just taking into account the general activity on that specific day on poll, because that might change during, for example, an election season or something like that. But in both graphs, I think very clearly shows this development into the 2020s and also like a bit before that, in, I guess I wager to say, in the wake of the Trump presidency, but perhaps also having like being related to other instances in which we talk about this fake news and things like that. Then there is, like, as Daniel had already pointed towards, the site-specific affordances, and I think we can also apply that perspective when we look at memory holding as being also influenced by this. I guess I'd call it an anxiety towards things being forgotten. So when you are posting and engaging in a social media in which threads and discourse and discussions are getting superseded by each other so quickly, the acts of memory holding, or at least pointing towards the concept of memory holding, trying to archive against it, or objecting to it, or appreciating those who are making threads pointing towards instances of memory holding, I think should be seen as sort of this collective act going against the ephemerality that is built within like a site such as 4chan. I guess you could also talk about like media logics behind how we're also living in like this modern period in which, both due to the media but also because of other things, that we're constantly acknowledging the rapidity of change, and how modernity is characterized by this crisis of instability, where the events just keep coming and piling up on themselves. So there is sort of, I guess you could say, sort of like a dissonance between a natural state of forgetting, or at least acknowledging the passing of events, and then being met with a reality in which the news keeps changing, or the narrative keeps changing, and because of that, you could possibly argue that memory holding is sort of this conspiratorial way in which you can try to understand, like, why do I still think this thing is important, but why does the media narrative then suddenly change, or something like that. And then finally, I think I'd also include this affective aspect, because I think it's very much tied to conspiracies in general, that engaging in conspiratorial thinking is also an effective act, and it's related to emotion, specifically anxiety around things, and the outrage, and, like I mentioned, the objection towards things becoming being a conspiracy, or things becoming memory hold and things like that. So in some ways, like this idea that in our postmodern world, where the truth as a post-truth society, where that doesn't really matter, or at least it's a lot more unstable, we tend to also find ourselves in like an effective epistemology, where it's no longer like the criteria for which something is true is, well, how deeply is it felt. And I think the act of conspiratorial thinking is something that engages people into this affective participation. So it's no longer like, well, maybe this isn't actually a conspiracy, or maybe this really doesn't matter. It's like, well, if it is a conspiracy, and if it's something that, if you can construct a narrative around the forgetting of memory as being performed by some outside forces actively trying to censor it, well, then that entails some sort of enragement and objection to that. I think is sort of the point I'll finish off with the quite a bit of time for the scene. Time for comments and a discussion on these things. I decoupling the chat and the ability to unmute yourself. So I think if there's anyone who wanna like kick off with a comment or a question to some of these things that we pointed to, they are more than welcome. Hopefully you are able to do that if I've done this correctly. You can also start your video. And you're also more than welcome to like use the reactions function to raise your hand if you want to say something. And
back to teaching during COVID. It's just like a little bit, right?
yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yes, Cheva, go ahead. If you are you able to unmute yourself? Yeah, you.
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question for the first speaker. In the quickly changing internet landscape of memes and how it's called slang, how do you make sure it doesn't go stale before publication? Because that's like in one of the posts you had in your slides, said that happens quite a lot. The EU often has, or they have published some handbooks for extremist memes, but every time they publish them, half or 70% of those memes are already outdated. There are those standard memes like the green frog, Pepe, Bojack, and Sputro, the brown bear, but they are quite versatile. You can use them for a lot and you can edit them. So they will be in use for God knows how long. But a lot of other memes, they fall to the floor quite quickly. And then when people use them, they mark themselves as an outgroup. Some of the memes in the extremist handbook, I have to find it, I have it saved somewhere. They look more like boomer memes you'd find on Facebook than memes you'd use on 4chan. Yes, that was it.
I think the only real answer to that question is that you have to stay subculturally literate for to be able to sort of communicate with these memes, right? And it's extremely difficult. I mean, I've done 2-3 years of ethnographic fieldwork on 4chan, and I still find it very difficult. So I think in terms of trying to create, I think this question goes along with sort of a number of interesting problems that are related to working with the internet, right? Because not only is the internet culture changing, but the structure of the environment itself is changing all the time. So trying to tell people how to study it or to engage with it in general is always problematic. And I think trying to teach or pinpoint general rules of thumb or general ways to then engage with engage with the content is the way to go, right? But it is a very, very difficult thing to do. And when you see sort of people who are able to do it are often, they're marketing whizzes on TikTok, right? They're able to do it, but then they capitalize quickly and they have a significant subcultural understanding of what's going on. TikTok is, in essence, very like 4chan in the ephemerality or in the pace and the development of subcultural innovation. Yeah, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was kind of thinking about the question because one of the images you had, the Bojack image on the second slide, it's actually from a right-wing cartoon from around 2015-16 called Murdoch Murdoch. It was quite popular during the Trump, Trump election, and yeah, generally extremist right-wing. But in it, they also comment on the emergence of New Paul, the Make America Great Again kind of boomer-ish conservative who tags along because of the memes but doesn't really understand it. When he tries to engage in it, he kind of is a fish out of water. So what was I about to say? I forgot what my point was, but yeah.
And I think your point, what you're saying there, sort of also underlines like the speed at which this happens, right? And the difficulty of being subculturally literate within these like highly ephemeral spaces. And I think that's really one of the wonderful things about this field, but it's also something that makes it really difficult to study. And also really sort of makes them obsessed with constantly reaffirming in-group status and the relationship with the group by then referencing the sort of collective memory that is presented through the vernacular.
Yeah. Also, if I may, I have another question. If there's nobody else who wants to ask a question.
I see that Boris has also raised his hand. So
yes, I'll wait.
Hear him, and you're welcome to ask your question after that.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Boris Noordenbos, University of Amsterdam. Thank you for these wonderful presentations. I have a couple of, I guess, remarks that sort of segue into questions, probably things that were interesting. I think would be relevant to discuss and to reflect upon. So the first observation is that on sort of at first sight, the things that you're doing both relate to memory and forgetting, and a platform like 4chan, but have a very different focus and point to a different dynamic, right? So in Daniel's presentation, it's basically about the way in which forms of forgetting, you could say maybe even amnesia, are built into the specific technological affordances of the platform, which indeed raise all kinds of sort of counter efforts at remembering, which are also described by indeed Tommaso Venturini. This idea that things need to be repeated, but they also at the same time need to stand out, right? So there's this sort of weird paradox where they need to be, in a way, almost extremist or radical, or at least be striking in one way or another in this sort of secondary oral type of dynamic in order to be maintained, in order to be preserved, at least somehow psychologically, maybe even. And in Philip's presentation, forgetting becomes something that has agency and that is thematized, right? So it is basically a discourse that tries to think through things that are important but that are supposedly hidden as structured through processes of forgetting. So that is sort of quite a different thing, but I was interested, and probably that's my first question, how I think you hinted at a potential relationship between those two different things, the thematization of forgetting as an active operation, so to say, in Philip's presentation, and the inbuilt affordance of ephemerality in Daniel's presentation. I guess another question that or maybe even the first question that I have is regarding Daniel's presentation. To what extent is this ephemerality not inherent in sort of meme culture in general? To what extent is it specifically conspiratorial? So how exactly is this part of a culture that is obsessed, intrigued, very much fixated on stories about conspiracy? And to what extent it is part of a larger, more general meme culture on social media platforms and on platforms like 4chan? That would be the first question. And my question for Philip would be, if forgetting is thematized in these discourses that circulate on social media platforms and on forums like 4chan, if it is thematized, why is it specifically framed, do you think, in terms of forgetting and not in sort of the more classic conspiratorial trope of covering up, for instance, right? So what exactly is the difference there? Why is there an interest in forgetting instead of just, things are hidden from us, which would be the age-old emphasis of conspiratorial discourse, over the past couple of ages? Do you see a relationship there between other forms of, sort of vernacular psychologization of things, right? So there's this whole meme about psyops, for instance, where things are supposedly part of a psychological operation. To what extent is this emphasis on memory holding linked to that sort of vernacular psychological discourse? So those are my questions. But thank you very much for two great presentations.
Thank you. Dan, do you want to start, or should I?
Sure. So first of all, I love your sort of inverting the thinking about ephemerality as a sort of what was the term you used, like enforced forgetting or something. That was excellent. I've never thought about it like that. As I understand your question, yes, this is very much the ephemerality here is very much sort of an example of what meme culture is in general, right? I think we see that pretty much consistently across the internet. As I said, TikTok is a pretty good example of something that is very reminiscent, but does not have like the conspiratorial thing. And that's where the sort of affordance perspective really needs to emphasize the cultural, the social aspect, because we can implement sort of ephemerality as a feature, but that would not instantly give us conspiracy theories, even though conspiracy theories, I think, and that's Venturini's point, also thrives in these ephemeral design spaces. Rather, I think that's where 4chan sort of, I think that's right-wing culture in general, and 4chan's in particular comes in, and it is what sort of mainly brings the conspiracy theories to the table. That's I think that's the brief version of it. Although it's a very good and deep question that can probably be written lots about.
I mean, I very much also enjoy the your point towards well, everything, but especially the forgotten versus covered up, because I haven't really considered it before. I guess for me, I don't think I see it necessarily as forgetting in a traditional memory study sense. For them, I think, like, there is this sort of paradox that I think is interesting to think about, where the concept of memory holding comes out of a literature piece that talks about the active destruction of evidence in paper form, in a material form, where in that narrative, I see the argument of the covering up and eventual destruction of memory as a lot more prevalent. And I think that anxiety is being carried over into the discourse we see on 4chan, but in a way, again, I guess perhaps related to affordances, but in any case, the fact that we are existing in a digital space, and as I pointed out with the examples, that they're heavily engaged with creating links, creating archives, referencing archives, referencing each other, reposting, creating threads, all of these, let's say, digital acts where this anxiety of things being, well, completely forgotten and absolutely destroyed, it doesn't really necessarily exist in sort of an interesting way, that even though they seem to expect this aspect of memory holding that will eventually let's say will eventually happen because they're dealing with this apparently controversial topic or whatever, that you know, they're sort of, well, negating themselves by engaging with this thing that are apparently being memory holes. So there is sort of like a circularity or something existing there, and yeah, so I think that's sort of my point towards that, and in a way, I think it is also a collective, and I like the word thematized, that there is also like a some sort of collective performative recontextualization of memory holding by the fact that they're seeing it as this conspiracy. Because I mean, for example, with the concept of conspiracy, it's never like it's never a quest for the truth in itself. It's more the journey itself. So like that when you're constantly like making these different Pizzagate threads, as Danny were talking about, it's not so much necessarily finding that one basement and uncovering everything. It's toying around and thematically constructing this eternal conspiracy that in itself lives on by its what's like the word that it can't be proved. Eventually, it will always live on. So in that sense, I think that's also a perspective that we could apply to the idea of memory holding, that the memories are actually, they are always in a state of being memory hold. They're never memory hold. So they are never going to be forgotten like the pieces of paper in the slit in 1984. They will constantly be in. Yeah, I think I made the point. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So maybe that explains also the difference between, this is a bit broad brushed what I'm saying now, but I can imagine that there is a difference in sort of a pre-digital age where sort of the imaginary is rather takes the form of covering things up, whereas in a period of ephemeral media, it is more about keeping things alive, sort of frantically. They're not absolutely gone, but they require an effort not to be memory hold. I think in this respect, would be interesting to look into the work of Murhat and Rosenblum, right? To write about new conspiracism and try to theorize the sort of, I do not always agree, but they try to theorize what conspiracy theory looks like in a digital age and how that is different from let's say the early 1990s and before. But thank you both. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there a second or third question somewhere?
Otherwise, I guess we'll let Cheve post his other question if you still want to do that. Else, I also have a brief comment to Daniel.
Yes, I would like to still ask a question. I'm a bit curious. Even though you guys mainly focus on Paul, have you looked at the other boards? Because Paul originally was made as a containment board for the political extremist ideas people kept posting on other places. So yeah, and a lot of those memes also they migrate from one board to another board, and then they come back, sometimes changed, sometimes the same. But there's a lot of play between the different boards, and also how they remember each other, or how they stereotype each other, and how they interact with each other. Paul also has quite a history of making not really movies, but sort of documentaries. I don't know if you guys have seen it. One about the Second World War. It's, I think, 6 hours long. It's terribly made from a history point of view, but it's called the Greatest Story Never Told. I watched it when I was, I think, 19 or 20, and even back then I could see that it's kind of weird, because at the end, when they love to put in sources, or what they considered sources. So I watched it until the end, watched the credits, and then all the sources were just different forums, Stormfront forums and such, and that gave them credibility, as if there was some esoteric hidden truth, which was, yeah, hidden from the mainstream, and only the true enlightened, politically active people online know about it. And yeah, sorry for the long question. One last thing. Also, have you guys looked at poll ideas that migrated onto social media? Personally, I'm quite interested in esoteric Hitlerism, which sometimes is posted on poll, but mainly from what I've seen, it's active on Twitter, more active on Twitter than on poll, because in a quasi-religion, you kind of need like people who can act as sort of priests, if that makes sense, to spread it, to be reliable, to be a known face, which image boards often don't rely. It can't provide.
Mhm. It's a it's a very interesting question of this, like making the jump from poll to or 4chan to sort of the more normie internet. And I think it's Daniel dMSA and et al. Wrote a paper called Tracing Normification or something like that, where they look at QAnon, and I think because the most famous examples of this is Pizzagate and QAnon,
Mhm.
that make this jump from poll, and then in the decontextualization of poll becomes something new, right? Because one thing that I didn't really touch upon is the very and it's too bad that that Line left the chat, because she wrote a really cool book chapter about this. But the role that play has in poll, right? So QAnon is probably 50% of the posts that's made to QAnon were probably LARPing, like role playing, just egging on the story for fun. And then of course there's some people also in poll who believe it. But then moving outside of the sort of playful space moves the conspiracy theory, especially conspiracy theory, but moves the ideas from a space where sort of there are people who are sort of role playing and people believing it, who can never know sort of how serious the thing is, into forums where people are explicitly like 100% serious, or at least seriouser than they are in 4chan, right? And I think that sort of that dynamic of all the implicit codes and norms that are present on 4chan, and what happens to things when they become, as dMSA et al. Termed it, normified, is really interesting. I personally haven't looked at it because I'm trying to figure out something that's going on 4chan, but I think that it's one of the most interesting, but also very most difficult things to study. Yeah, if anyone feels up for that, please go do that kind of multi-platform analysis, because that would be awesome.
It is a bit funny with QAnon that one of their main catchphrases has the ambiguity of is it true or not? The trust the plan, and you have to be a plan truster. Just trust what he says. It's cute. He has the answers.
And I think that's a clear example of something being a little bit, someone who writes something a little bit tongue in cheek, and then someone who's not, like in on this being a joke, just like doubles down on it and goes, yes, this is our motto now. And then it's like, it's a little funny for people who aren't completely delusional or are completely delusional in a different way, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With those words, I'll end it up here and say thank you everyone for coming to this event, and thank you, Daniel, for giving a very interesting presentation and being able to hear. It's always a joy to hear about your research. So thank you everybody, and have a pleasant afternoon, evening, morning, from wherever you're from.
Bye everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.
Bye bye.